Right, this is a video. We're going to look at the railroads of Crawfordsville, Indiana. So back in the 1950s and 60s, all the way up to 1974, there was actually three different railroads that intersected in Crawfordsville, Indiana. So the direction of this photograph is actually looking south. We would be looking towards the Nucor plant, which is maybe a mile or two down this track. So we have an old Pennsylvania railroad. See this line right here? This used to go straight down right by the park, and then it went through New Market and Waveland and all the way down to Terre Haute. This was an old Pennsylvania line. Now this railroad, this used to be the old Peoria and Eastern, which got absorbed into the New York Central network, and it went from Indianapolis all the way to Peoria. And the railroad right below us, this would be the old Monon, which is now the CSX line from Greencastle, Indiana, all the way up through Lafayette and then to Chicago. So if you look at the right of this photograph, this is an old neighborhood. It looks like something from the 1950s. I do believe this neighborhood was built in the 1950s. And right now it's more kind of like a ran down neighborhood. There's a lot of crumbling houses. But try to imagine this was brand new in the 1950s. These people first moved in here. Think about how entertaining that would have been. They saw three different train engines go by their neighborhood. They saw locomotives that said Monon headed south through Ladoga. They saw locomotives that said New York Central going towards Indianapolis and Peoria or Illinois. And they also saw locomotives that said Pennsylvania going towards Terre Haute and Frankfort. So in 1968, the Pennsylvania and the New York Central merged and created this monster called the Penn Central. And their goal was basically to cut out as many unneeded tracks as possible, try to create an efficient, profitable railroad company. So when that happened, you have to understand, this railroad, this old Pennsylvania line that went through New Market and on to Terre Haute, this had no chance of survival. In 1968, when the Penn Central was formed, see, the only thing keeping this railroad alive for the Pennsylvania was profits, money being made in the Crawfordsville area. Once it merged with the New York Central, you understand they had superior routes, and this line had no chance. It was toast. In 1974, it got removed from service. And what's also interesting, this line went through Colfax, which actually had a diamond of another New York Central line going up to Lafayette. So even if there was some kind of profiting business like a grain elevator business in Colfax, it had no chance of survival in Colfax. Now the north-south track, the Monon, before the L&N merged or took over the Monon, this railroad by itself would have been a profiting, well-established railroad. In one aspect, it's a tragedy that it merged, but in another aspect, because of this chassis and seaboard system that we know as CSX, this is now a super railroad from Indianapolis to Crawfordsville to Lafayette and then on up to Chicago. They've invested like $100 million putting down welded rail, and this track gets around 7 to 8, sometimes even more, trains per day. Alright, so if you go down to the Crawfordsville Park, what you'll notice is this tall, flat hill towards the back of the park. And what that tall hill was, that was the Pennsylvania Railroad that went from Frankfort all the way down to Terre Haute. See this? This is the golf course, and I'm standing in the park. And this was the old Pennsylvania line. It got removed in 1974. This is another picture of Dairylicious in Crawfordsville, Indiana, and from my understanding, this is the only section of that old Pennsylvania Railroad that still remains. Everything else is wiped out, from Frankfort through Colfax, through Darlington, through Crawfordsville, through New Market. through Waveland, all the way to Terre Haute. It's all been wiped out and removed. This is all that's left, maybe 1 mile of track. And it serves just a couple local businesses. Alright, so let's take a look at the profit in this area that the railroad makes. This is a picture. Behind me, 1 mile behind me, would be Nucor Steel. And they've laid down welded rail all the way to their main line. So this is a train that is stopped. We have another train on a siding. And right over here would be the old Peoria and Eastern, which is now the Indianapolis to Crawfordsville to Lafayette CSX main line. And this is a train on the Peoria and Eastern. Now, believe it or not, all these pictures were taken on the same day. This just shows you how much train traffic, the potential that this area gets on a daily basis. It's actually outstanding. Now, if you go back to the main picture, see this trailer, this large shanty right here? This is the CSX office, and this area gets so much train traffic, or train business, railroad business. They actually have 2 full-time CSX employees in this region or area. This is their office, and they work every day. Alright, so this is a map of the Csx Heritage Map. And basically, you can see this is Crawfordsville, this is the Monon, this is the old New York Central, and unfortunately the Pennsylvania line is nowhere to be found. Alright, let's look at another interesting picture of this region. So this is from 2010. This is CSX's tonnage map, and this has definitely changed over the last 10 years. So in 2017, CSX spent around $100 million on someone else's railroad so that they could have high-speed freights going down from Louisville to Indianapolis. And a lot of these trains, these 2-mile-long freight trains, get routed right through Crawfordsville and right on up into Lafayette and into Chicago. So in the last 3 and 4 years, we have experienced increased train traffic. So when CSX had split up Conrail back in '99, they had big plans for this line, this railroad. They already knew they were going to spend big money laying down welded rail from Indianapolis all the way up to the Monon and all the way to Chicago, which makes me happy because most of the Peoria and Eastern has been wiped out. So at least one section is a high volume railroad. I'm glad something good came out of a part of the Peoria and Eastern. So as far as the Crawfordsville region goes, as of today we see around 7 to 10 freight trains a day rolling through the Crawfordsville area. Some of you are curious about this brown line that you see. Believe it or not, Waveland years ago used to have 2 railroads that ran through its small town. From Waveland all the way to Lebanon, this line got removed in the 1920s, maybe 1928. So it was definitely not an important or needed railroad. But it is interesting that at one time this small town of Waveland actually had 2 railroads running through it. Now, something else that's interesting about the railroads of Crawfordsville, Indiana, is the 3 major businesses that make millions of dollars for CSX and Norfolk Southern every year. You can see one of them is obviously Nucor Steel, which is below Crawfordsville. They've actually laid down welded rail all the way to this large plant. And in just the past decade, this other large grain business spurred up below Nucor. In fact, they get so much business, they have 3 large sidings on this grain business. And then the third, but not least, I think it's the biggest money maker in this region. If you notice, north of Crawfordsville is this small town called Linden. And they have a large ethanol producing factory or plant. And I'm sure you've heard of this name called Cargill. You've probably seen that on like tanker train cars. They make millions of dollars a month off of this business. Remember, the railroad charges by weight. So if you've got tanker cars full of ethanol, you get to charge by how much that tanker car weighs. So they're making millions of dollars a month off of this large business. But as you can see from these aerial photographs, I mean, there is a lot of tanker cars and there is a lot of profit being made. In fact, a few miles north of this plant, which would be, I guess, south of Romney, they have constructed another brand new siding. I think it's a 2-mile long siding, which is just more evidence of the increased train traffic on this line. But that about wraps it up for the railroads of Crawfordsville, Indiana, and its welded rail from Indianapolis to Crawfordsville to Lafayette to Monon to Chicago.